Hi all, today I'm going to show you a very few nice tricks on the Budapest Gambit. The position that we have in front is the Budapest Gambit, and we reach that position by playing the moves d4, which leads to a queen's pawn game, knight f6, which leads to an Indian defense, and here c4 is the most common reply. White wants to take control of the center, but white can't play the move e4 here because knight is controlling the square. That's why after c4, here black has lots of replies. e6 is one of them, g6 is one of them, and a less common move is the move e5, which leads to the Budapest Gambit. And what's interesting about seeing the Budapest Gambit is that the Budapest Gambit is fairly sound, fairly playable. Some gambits, they are more of a gamble than a gambit, but this opening has some positional points, so it's interesting to play at least in a few games. So here black gives a pawn, so the most common reaction is to take it. We'll analyze other ideas, but here black normally replies with the move knight to g4. Let me just briefly mention that knight to e4 was another option, main option, but knight g4 is more popular. And here white normally tries to defend the pawn, so basically black sacrifices a pawn, and if black can take back this pawn, then black already has good development. Normally this bishop comes with check, black will castle easily. So all in all, if black manages to get the pawn back, black will get a good position. After bishop to f4, defending the pawn, again the most common reaction is to play knight to c6, trying to get this pawn back. So here normally white will try to defend the pawn. So knight to f3 develops a knight and defends the pawn. And here black continues with bishop to b4, is very common. Bishop to c5 was another idea, but bishop to b4 is a bit more common. And here after white plays the move knight to d2, then black plays the move queen to e7 and will get this pawn back normally. Let me briefly mention, if white plays knight to c3 instead of knight bd2, this is another alternative to try to defend the pawn with queen to d5. And here black has a lot of options, but probably the simplest way to continue is to play on c3. And after taking, then queen e7, tries to get the pawn back. And if white tries to defend the pawn to claim an advantage, then here black has an interesting move, which is f6. And after white takes the pawn, knight takes. So here black has better development, and also these two pawns, they are normally not worth 2 pawns. Just to illustrate with a line, then after queen d3, the queen was attacked, then black will develop very quickly. Then basically here black can play bishop to g4, for example, bring the other rook, and have very good compensation, having good development and considering that white's pawns are fairly weak. So instead, if white tries to play more solid with knight bd2, normally black will not have a lot of problems. So after queen to e7, black is getting the pawn back. And here the most logical move for white is to continue developing with e3, maybe g3. But after the move a3, which looks very natural, then here black has a very interesting trap, which is to take on e5. So the point is that if white takes the bishop, then knight to d3 is checkmate. And if white takes on e5, then an interesting idea is to try again this trap, which is taking again on e5. And if white takes on b4, then we have this checkmate again. The point is that the pawn is pinned. And after knight takes e5, black got the pawn back, and normally we'll have a very good position. For example, now if white takes on e5, then we can first take with check, and then after queen d2 we take on e5, and we see that lots of pieces have been exchanged and black has a very solid position. Now here I want to show a few other traps. If we go back to the initial gambit position, so taking on e5 is the most logical reaction, but if white tries to gain space advantage with the move d5, Then black in return have very good development. Bishop to c5 is a very logical move. We develop the bishop and then we plan to play d6. And we also set a nice trap. So here white should normally continue developing, probably with the knight. But after the move bishop to g5, then black has two very nice traps that I want to show here. So the first is taking on f2 with a check. And after king takes, then we play knight to g4. And we get this bishop back. And here I want to make another note. Instead of knight to g4, knight to e4 also looks tempting, but this will complicate the game quite a lot, because here white has the very interesting actually king to e3, and if we take with the knight, then after h4 this knight doesn't have very good squares. Although even here if white gets a piece, white's king in the center is not looking very well, but this really complicates matters unnecessarily. And also here if we take on g5, then we have this very funny situation with the king in the center. I'm not sure what goes on here, but I would not complicate matters here as black. If we can gain a pawn for nothing, I would prefer the line where we play knight to g4 and just take on g5. And another very nice trap here, instead of taking with the bishop, we have a very pretty move, which is knight to e4, just giving the queen. And if white takes the queen, then we have the move bishop takes f2 checkmate. And here white has a lot of problems because white has to defend on f2, and the bishop, probably the only move that defends those two threats is bishop to e3. But after we take on e3, take on e3, then we have the move queen to h4 check, which is very strong. g3 is the only move, and here we can take this pawn, and we see that this pawn is pinned. If we take, then we just take the rook, and white can try one last move, knight to f3, attacking the queen. And here we need to keep the queen on the h file. That's why we can play the move queen to h6. And again, the knight cannot be taken because we just take the rook, and black has a decisive advantage. So just to summarize the three traps in the Budapest Gambit, the first is after the move a3 to not move the bishop but to take on e5, where we have this very nice threat of knight to d3 checkmate. The second trap is after the move bishop to g5 to take on f2. And remember that after king takes, knight g4 is definitely more solid, and we get a pawn, so we have a much better position, if not winning. And last is the more spectacular move, knight to e4, giving the queen and giving a checkmate on f2, after which white will have to play the move bishop to e3, but after we exchange bishops, we just play queen to h4, getting a huge material advantage. I hope that you enjoyed these traps, that you can use it in your games, and I'll see you soon.